why don't you focus on funding on outputs, not a throughput like course completion? And I said to him, well, the reason I proposed that, I had thought about doing a variant of our performance incentive funding metrics because institutions were used to them, and apparently institutions were, if not satisfied with the metrics, they at least accepted them. But I thought that the easiest way to do it was to fund on completed courses. And he said, no, why don't you try to do something related to the actual desired outcomes? And so we started working on the metrics that have evolved into what we have most recently proposed to you all and to the legislature. The metrics were developed very carefully. We think that they're very close to, if not at the point that we're comfortable with, but we want to hear from you about your concerns. These metrics are not firm yet. There's still a little softness in them. Which means that we're willing to listen to the comments that you make today, and if we need to tweak them, we will. Obviously, we can't do a whole lot more tweaking because we have to come to a final methodology very quickly because the legislature is moving quickly. What I've heard over and over again from institutional representatives is that institutions, by and large, are comfortable with the notion of funding some portion of the formula based on performance, but that the apprehension now, I see some heads shaking no, but we can discuss that. What I have heard more consistently is that there is confusion about the metrics. There's acceptance of the concept, but confusion about the actual metrics themselves. That's the purpose of this meeting. We want to make sure that you understand what we're proposing, how the four metrics work, and we'll, as I say, listen to whatever concerns you have. I also want to make a point about something else that we've heard from institutions fairly regularly, and that is that institutions are very wary of changing formula funding, the formula funding metrics at a time when the budget situation in the legislature looks so dire. I have said time and again, and you will hear it again this morning, that using these metrics for 10% of formula funding does not increase the variability of funding levels that currently are the case. David Gardner, who has overall responsibility for this area of the agency's work, has indicated frequently that enrollment is a substantial variable. There are some institutions that are growing very fast. There are others that are not. And funding on enrollment is a very significant variable. Introducing the four variables that we are proposing for 10% of formula funding does not increase the variability. The swings that will occur based on using these metrics will not be any greater than the swings that occur as a result of enrollment, of funding on enrollment. The other point I'd like to make in that regard is that we think that having some portion of funding gauged to performance on the metrics that you'll hear more about in just a minute actually gives institutions more of a chance to control and determine their level of funding than simple enrollment growth. Because some institutions don't have that much control over enrollment growth. Obviously, UT Austin is the most dramatic example where enrollment is capped. But there are other institutions in parts of the state that are not growing very quickly that don't have the opportunity to expand enrollments quickly. Furthermore, I'd like to make the comment that we've heard from institutions, and we've done this exercise ourselves, so it applies to everybody in this room. Institutions have done runs and have said, if we went to this methodology for funding institutions, we would lose money. That simply isn't true. We don't know which institutions would get larger shares of funding or which institutions would lose funding. It all depends on how well you respond to the proposed metrics. The runs that we have done and the runs that you have done are based on a retrospective look at what you've been doing. Presumably, the whole intent of these metrics is to incentivize your institutions to pay even more attention, and notice I said even more attention, to student success. So the institutions that will fare the best are not the ones that have done runs that show they would get more money. The institutions that will do the best are the institutions that aggressively promote student success. So it's important to make sure everybody understands that. These retrospective runs have very limited usefulness. One last point, and then I'll turn it over to, I guess, Susan. Who? Paul? Okay. We have gone through a lot of iterations of these metrics. We've talked about these metrics around the state. We've talked to a number of institutional leaders, and we have tried to be responsive to your concerns and your suggestions. The point of this meeting is to give us this one last opportunity to get it as close to a consensus level of support as possible. We will listen to you, and I promise you we will take into account all of the recommendations, all of the expressions of concerns in order to get this right. Our goal is not to hurt institutions. Our goal is to help institutions move more aggressively towards achieving the goals of closing the gaps, and to focus equally on the goal of success compared to the extraordinary success we've had in Texas in terms of building access. We need a balance between the two. We've had some institutions, I've heard some institutional representatives say that the coordinating board and the commissioner in particular are not that much interested in access anymore. Of course we are. 90% of your funding will still come from enrollment. We are interested in access. We want a balance between the two. We want a balance between access and success. And as all of you know, in Texas, as around the country, we've had much more success over the past 25, 30 years in expanding access to higher education. We've had much less success in terms of actually raising completion rates, particularly for low-income students and students of color. And as all of you know, those are the bulk of students that are coming through the pipeline right now. So we have to do it better than we're currently doing it. And that's the genesis, and that's the rationale for the recommended metrics related to performance-based funding. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over. Does anyone have any questions of me before I turn it over to Paul? Okay.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to sit down if that's okay, so the folks behind won't be blocking their view. I'm Paul Turcott. I am a program director here at the coordinating board. And just to set the expectation, my presentation will be through the mechanics of the model. I'll be just walking you through comparing this to the performance incentive funding model. For those out listening to the broadcast, you can find the presentation and the handouts on the coordinating board page, on the finance and resource planning page. Also, if you have a question and you're listening to the broadcast, you can email Thomas Keaton at thecb.state.texas.us, and we will review those questions in the Q&A period. For reference, the model that we're proposing is identical to the performance incentive funding model that was funded with ARRA funds in fiscal year 10 and 11. The only exceptions to that, and there are 3, is we've reduced it to undergraduate degrees only. We've added a factor or metric for the above and below prediction degree counts. And finally, we've weighted the critical degrees twice as many as they were before. So the 4 factors are all weighted 1, with the exception of critical fields that's weighted at 2. The model is basically 50-50, with 50% of the funding that's put into the model on increases, a biennial increase. So we take the last 2 years and we average it, and we take the 2 years before that and we average it, we take the difference, and that's 50% of the model for increases. The second half of the funding would go toward a 3-year average. So we take the last 3 years, we average those degree counts for each one of the factors, and points are derived that way. Here's a mechanical example, or math. You can see that this particular institution, for total undergraduate degrees, awarded 400, 200, again 200, and 100 degrees for fiscal years 10 through 7. On the left side of the slide, you can see we took the 2-year average of those. For each set of 2 years, we got 300 and 150. And then finally, in the blue segment, you can see that their increase was determined to be 150 degrees. On the second side of the model, we've got the 3 years, so we've got 400, 200, and 200 for fiscal years 10 through 8. We take the 3-year average of that, and we get 267 points or degrees. Those 2 are added together, and that's what you get for the model for points for total undergraduate degrees. This is done for the other 3 metrics, same math all the way through. There are a total of 4 factors or metrics. We just went over the total undergraduate degrees. Those are all your baccalaureate and your associate of applied sciences. Again, you have your undergraduate critical degrees, exactly the same as they were determined in the PIF as found on the accountability system. And then you have your at-risk degrees, and there are the 4 pieces of data that determine a student as at risk. Finally, we have our newly introduced above and below predicted. So the above and below predicted has really 2 different pieces of data that go into it. I'm going to talk about the math that gets us to the number of degrees, and then Don Godin is going to take over and talk about the regression analysis that determines the predicted portion. As you can see with the formula, we take your actual graduation rate minus your predicted graduation rate. Now, for the 4-year universities, we use a 6-year graduation rate, and for the upper level institutions, we're using a 3-year graduation rate. We take that difference and we multiply it by the cohort. For the universities, the cohort is first time full-time in college, coming directly from high school, and for the upper levels, it is the first time they were reported as a junior on our reports. You can see the math there. If an institution had an actual graduation rate of 90% and a predicted graduation rate of 80%, they'd have a difference of 10%. If that was out of a cohort of 200 students, or sorry, 2,000 students, they would have points or degrees of 200 in the model. And that's done for each of the 4 years that go into it. And then we go back to that math we were talking about a moment ago, where we do the biennial averages and the 3-year averages. So here's where I'm going to turn it over to Don, and he's going to go through the regression analysis.
One of the concerns with outcome-based funding is one of the concerns with outcome-based funding is you're funding the institution that has the better outcomes. You're also, in a way, funding an institution that started off with the better prepared students in the first place. The regression equation is a way to say, given the demographics of the student population, what should be the achievement level of the students in that institution. So basically, we did a 6-year graduation rate as an outcome measure, and for the 4-year institutions, we took a look at the percent Pell and the top 10% students in the class that came directly from public high schools. And in the upper level institutions, we took a look at the credits attempted in the last 2 years and the percent Pell. And basically that regression, we did all the institutions and then took out the upper level, the values for the upper level to figure out what the number should be for them. Okay, Paul, next slide. Basically what a regression is you're taking a look at what the relationship is between factors statewide, and there's a scatter plot there. We'll show you each institution would be one of those stars. There's a relationship between Pell. Not actually the figures here, this is just kind of an example. And you draw a line. No, that's fine. But you draw a line through the scatter plot, so it's midway between all the points in the scatter plot, and that gives you a concept of what that relationship is, where you go across a line from the percent Pell and down to 6-year graduation rate. That's pretty much the expected level. So basically, we're taking the statewide graduation rate from the regression line and using that to come up with the predicted. And that basically gives us a residual, which is the difference between the predicted and the actual graduation rate. And that's what we multiply by the cohort to get the figures that are used for funding.
Are there any questions about this? Okay. Next slide. All right. Now is the time for y'all to ask questions, talk about it. See, give us what you like, what you don't like, what you understand, and what you still don't understand. And Mike's thinking, oh my God.
Can you go back over the regression model again?
Okay.
All of you that have something to say, make sure you have a microphone so people can hear you online.
Yeah, I just wanted them to go back over the regression model again. I just want to make sure that, you know, I really had that down. That's critical.
Okay, basically, this kind of illustrates what a regression is. It's basically putting a line through a scatter plot. This is just one dimension. We're taking a look between the 6-year graduation rate and percent Pell. You've got to imagine this 3-dimensional when you've got another factor in there, but this illustrates basically what the concept is. That line goes directly through the scatter plot, so the space between the line and the bottom points is exactly the same as the space between the line and the top points. So basically what that is, we use least squares to figure that out, formula to figure that out. And if this relationship is statistically significant, which it is, and controls the variance, it gives us an idea of what's responsible for the difference between the graduation rates of different institutions. And we find that in this instance, the average of the 4 years using percent Pell and top 10% of the institution, this is an institutional level analysis, we can predict 82% of the variance in statewide graduation rates. So then once we have that line is basically a formula, tells us where that line is, and from that formula we can figure out where the projected graduation rate would be. So we've got the actual graduation rate and we've got the projected graduation rate. If the projected graduation rate is higher than the actual, then it seems like, given the demographics of that institution, they should be graduating more students. Where it's the other way around, if it's lower, well, let's see, did I say that right? If the projected is higher, that means they need to be graduating more. If the projected is lower than the actual graduation rate, that means they're doing better than expected given the demographics of their school population.
In other words, each institution is compared against their incoming students. You're not compared against everybody else's students. You're being compared against the students that you have coming into your institution.
Why did you choose to use a predicted model rather than an actual outcome base? So comparing outcomes of Permian Basin over time rather than predicting an outcome?
We're actually using both, because if you look at the first three factors in that, the number of graduates, the critical fields, and the at-risk students, those are all the actual numbers. We got comments from legislators asking us to be able to look at how students are doing compared to themselves, how they're doing, based on factors, SAT, that sort of thing. We found when we looked at it, these two factors, the top 10% and the Pell, seemed to, they actually gave us the best prediction of those factors, of that.
Some of the other variables.
We took a look for the 4 years. We couldn't take a look at SAT. We actually didn't have the ACT to convert to SAT for several of the years.
Look at SAT, did you say?
Right. We didn't have the data, basically, for the 4 years in question. We decided not to take a look at TSI readiness because we would have to go from the TSI to the task spheres, so we wouldn't really have an equivalent. But I can give you a list of the different variables. So with the upper level, there was about 36 variables we took a look at.
Go ahead and just mention some of them so that they have a clue.
Okay, let's see. I'm trying to think of what we had there. Should have brought a list. I've been going through the upper level and I'm thinking about that right now, but I can get a list and bring it back after a break.
Yeah, send it to us. Are you going to share any of the?
Turn on your microphone, will you, please?
Are you going to share any of the details of your analysis? I'd kind of like to see the plots of the error rates.
I can certainly send them to you, sure.
Okay.
Basically, with both variables and all four.
R-square is really high, but there's. I'd still like to see the error plots.
Yeah, that's fair. There may be more questions, but about how this was calculated. But when we're through those, I'd like for you to mention, Susan, to what amount of the funding would actually be determined by this particular measure. I think that's important for people to understand.
Are there more questions or? Okay. And Paul's going to correct me because he's looked at the most recent set of numbers more than I have. Because we just reran them based on the House Appropriations Subcommittee to go back and include the top 10%, or teaching supplement. So I think the part of the funding based on this predicted graduation is about 1.3%.
That sounds about right.
About 1.3% of this 10% of undergraduate funding. So of the total outcomes-based funding, approximately 1.3% is from the predicted graduation rate data.
So we think that's something important for people to realize that we don't think's been understood, and it's also important to understand this has really been put there because of institutional concerns over the years about really being compared to institutions with very different kinds of students, and to try to at least make public that you really shouldn't expect a higher graduation rate from some institutions given the students that they're bringing in. They may actually be doing extraordinarily well given the preparation of their students and the financial background of their students when they come in.
Did you consider or look at all at the increases in graduation rates over time, like the trending there as a potential variable?
We did not look at the trending over time for the graduation rates, mainly because of all of the complaints that we have had about the overall graduation rate. And as you noticed, Don said that, or somebody said, Paul said, that we're only looking at those first-time, full-time directly from high school. So we're not looking at some institutions bring in a lot of their first-time entering students who have been out of school for 4 or 5 years, that sort of thing. So they don't have as many of those students that are directly out of high school. And so we took that into account by only including that part of the cohort. The graduation rate on the other, standard graduation rate on the other hand, does not do that. It includes all first-time entering, and it doesn't take into account the income level of the students, so it's a little bit harder to do that.
Yeah, it's also, I'm glad to say that virtually all of our universities have seen an almost annual increase in their 6-year graduation rate. So we've been pleased to see that. We've gone up statewide another 1% percentage point this year, with only one or two institutions seeing an exception. So almost every school, I'm glad to say we've seen some increase with each cohort. But also, I just want to make clear that those students that aren't included in the graduation rate are included in the other measures. So it's really about graduates, whether they started at your institution, where they transferred from somewhere else, where they came from a community college, they might have started 20 years ago, and you got them back into school. They actually are going to be accounted for in this proposal, which we think is very important, especially to an institution like, for example, UTEP, that's had an increase of 80% of the graduates since 2000, but their graduation rate really hasn't budged, but they are really producing many more graduates.
First of all, thank you for holding this briefing. I'd like to see some discussion about the effect on the method of finance and the integrity of the existing formula when you pull out 10% of the funding from only the undergraduate, and meanwhile the other E&G income portion remains as it is, and we've changed the fundamental dynamic between undergraduate and graduate. And it seems to me, perhaps I don't understand it well enough, that the unavoidable conclusion is we're ending up with two formulas, one for undergraduate, one for graduate, and that has implications for decisions made in the legislative environment that concern at least this person, maybe others.
Yeah, I think that's a really terrific question. I'm not going to answer it, but I would like to say that one reason that we made that separation was at the request of some institutions. So that was part of...
Some institutions, including this one,
Yes.
might have been wrong.
Well, I'm saying it was a good question, but I'm just saying that it's in some cases...
Okay, and we
do
did-
respond to requests, and some people will be happy and others not.
Okay, and we did actually look at it originally by pulling out 10% of all the funds and awarding it. However, the focus that we have had is on undergraduate, graduate degrees and that sort of thing. And when you pull out all of the money and then you award points, and they're not going to be able to get any of these points based on graduate degrees, we decided that it skewed things. Talk about variability. That really changed it. So what we did is we scaled it back because you're only able to get points for those undergraduate degrees. So we're focusing on undergraduates, so we felt it was more fair and more equitable to allocate 10% of the undergraduate funding and not include the graduate funding on those degrees. We can share some of those early runs with you.
That's fine. I understand why you wouldn't take 10% of all the formula funds and then reallocate them only to undergrad. I get that. That's predictable. What I don't think we've really addressed is the very strong likelihood that we're creating two formulas, one for graduate and one for undergraduate. And you've got method of finance issues involved there when you construct the bill, and you've got decision points now separated for graduate education and undergraduate. And I sense a distinction in value associated with those two levels of programs in the environment where these decisions get made. And I think it's of concern.
I'm not sure I understand the point that you're making, Ed. Let's say that...
Okay.
And of course, I know you understand that there are different weights for graduate courses, which are still represented there and still represent a certain recognition of value and costs associated with those graduate programs.
Any other questions?
Okay, I'm going to give this a try and try to explain what I think Stanton is trying to get at. So back when there were, whatever, 12 formulas or whatever, the legislature had to make a decision between, did they want to put money into instruction? Did they want to put money into libraries? Did they want to put money into infrastructure? And I mean, we've been in HAC subcommittee and we've all seen how difficult it is for them to make a decision. And so now, if we start moving into, we're going to fund undergraduate education based on a shift towards graduation rates, but we're not going to do that for graduates because graduates are not at risk. They already have a bachelor's degree. Then when we get to the legislature next time and the time after that and the time after that, the legislature has to decide, you know, there's a limited amount of funding, and do they add money to outcomes-based funding for undergraduate education, or do they add money to the enrollment formula for graduate students? I think that's kind of the path, you know, and they already have to do this. You know, they have to decide between financial aid, and they have to decide between the academics, and they have to decide between the health-related, decide between research funding versus funding the formula. And so I think the concern is that this is just more decision that they're going to have to distinguish where they put the funding. That they're not already doing that, it's just one more layer.
I understand your point, but I don't understand what the apprehension about that is.
Let me let Paul explain how he does this, and that might help. So Paul's going to go ahead and explain how these weights are done.
Okay, I think I understand what you want me to talk about. I think I understand the concern of method of finance. We don't really make the determination here at the coordinating board. That's something that's not working. That's something that's done at the LBB. They determine how method of finance work, and they have asked us how we envision this could work. The current version that they're working on is that the bill would be written, business as usual, and the comptroller would have the authority to adjust your GR in the second year based on the data that we provide. That's to accommodate institutions the opportunity to change these numbers during the biennium. So in order for that to work, right now, the way the formula works is they take your GRD out of the formula, and the residual, the remaining amount, is GR. Well, they would show the bill that way. However, for this outcomes-based funding, the adjustment would occur for GR only and not your GRD, because your GRD has already been taken out and is not in that same account at the comptroller's office. Does that make sense? Is that what you were trying to get to with your question?
Okay. Credit hour.
So that was completely off topic. I apologize. All right, so we want to talk about the relative weights and the cost study. Each year, your staff goes through a lot of work to get me the expenditures by fiscal year to match to your AFR, broken out by not only discipline, the 20 disciplines, but also the 5 levels of instruction, 2 of which are undergraduate and 3 of which are graduate level. That cost per semester credit hour, all based off of whatever cost per semester.
Wait a moment. Some of the folks that were interested are engaged in something else. Let's make sure everybody that was interested in the question is ready to hear your answer. Okay.
Okay. So we get a cost per semester credit hour for each discipline and weight. We've got 100 of them sitting there, and we divide each one of those by the undergraduate, lower level, liberal arts cost per semester credit hour. So that creates a relative weight. Those are the relative weights you see in the General Appropriations Act. Is that what you're looking for?
He takes those weights and then divides the the total dollars appropriated to the general academic I&O formula gets divided by the total weighted semester credit hours. That determines how much of the fund goes to graduate versus undergraduate. Undergraduate amount. So not going to be saying, okay, this much money goes to graduate, this much money goes to undergraduate. All of the weighted semester credit hours would be divided up to get the amount of the weight, and that's the dollars per weighted semester credit hours that would go into all of the attempted hours for the graduate programs. The undergraduate dollars per weighted semester credit hour would then have 10% removed for the second year of the biennium, and that would give the number of weighted semester credit hours for the undergraduate would then be divided by, or the remaining 90% of the funds would then be divided by the weighted credit undergrad. Yeah, this one's not working either. Divided by the weighted semester credit hours for undergraduate. At that point, the other 10% would be allocated using this outcome performance-based system. And Susan has a inquisitive look on her face.
If I heard your statement correctly, it sounds like you're concerned that the legislature, if we take this approach, will say, okay, well, let's actually break these things apart and develop separate pots of money that we're going to make decisions on it. That's really was fundamentally your question, right? That's not what we're proposing, but you're concerned that that's what they'll do. Is that fair? Okay.
Okay. Did that answer your question, Stan? No? Okay. We'll have to deal with that one offline.
I'll try to make another go at the method of finance issue. The way this is constructed works fine in a single method of finance structure, and the way you all look at the formulas. You look at it in an all funds methodology and don't worry about those method of finance issues. When you pull that money out, that money doesn't come out even for all institutions. We all have different proportions of E&G that we contribute to the formulas. So when you pull out an amount of general revenue, because you can't pull out our GRD and give that to someone else. So when you pull it out, you're pulling out different proportions of each institution's undergraduate funding and leaving different methods of finance. There's also the issue of method of finance or tuition coming in at different rates for undergraduate and graduate programs. And when you separate these out as two decisions, the LBB is going to completely have to rework how they generate our tuition income estimates, because you'll need two different tuition income estimates for graduate and undergraduate education. From the LBB's implementation of pulling this out of the formulas, it becomes a real complex issue that doesn't work very well.
That is something that we can work with them and try to provide as much help as we can to them on how to implement that so that it does come out in an equitable manner. But yeah, you're right. There is some discrepancy between the amount, how they pull the GRD, because everybody's GRD is different, and we understand.
It moves funding, unintended changes of funding that aren't related to this because of how the formula works in kind of a zero-sum game.
And I think inevitably you can't deal with this without eventually dealing with undergraduate and graduate separately. If you're going to do it equitably and proportionately to the way that the other E&G is contributed toward the formula by each institution. And that leads us to separate decision points and separate probable funding levels for undergraduate and graduate. And certain institutions are much more affected by that than others are. That's where some of us have concerns about unintended consequences.
Can I go back to the fundamentals rather than the technical details of the distribution? Can you just explain what behavior you're trying to encourage with this model? I guess the second part of the question is, and how does the model do that? How does the effective distribution of funds?
And if I can add, in relation to the success points that you accumulate.
Well, it's obvious that we want to promote higher completion rates for universities. We want more students to graduate. We have 6-year graduation rates that are in the mid 50% range, and we think that's inadequate. We want institutions to devote more attention to develop innovative programs that promote retention and ultimate completion. And the metrics address that issue very, very directly. We are going to fund partially on the basis of the number of graduates that institutions produce. We're concerned that we're not intentionally responding to the workforce needs as strongly as we should. So we have a metric in there to fund the number of graduates that institutions produce in specific high-demand workforce fields. We're very concerned about the fact that a very large percentage of students that are coming through the pipeline are poor. They're students of color, the first generation. They're going to need a lot of help. They're ambitious and they're eager, but we know, unfortunately, that poverty correlates with attending low-performing high schools. So we want to make sure that as we enroll those students, institutions recognize that those students will need more in the way of academic support. And we want institutions to move aggressively to provide adequate academic support services for those students. And we know that institutions will do what they're reimbursed for. It's very clear if you look at the enrollment growth in Texas over the past 10, 12 years, or since the current formulas were established. It's very clear that the emphasis has been on providing access. As I said, we need to achieve a proper balance between access and success. We're not doing nearly as well in terms of producing graduates as we should. And what we are proposing is very similar to what is now being proposed in at least 15 other states. It's supported by the Obama administration. It's supported by the two foundations that do most of the work in higher education. So I think it's what we are proposing is very consistent with the best thinking that's going on right now about how to produce a higher level of productivity in our institutions of higher education.
It's also important to remember that the basic elements of this were developed and discussed extensively with representatives from institutions when it was part of the incentive fund. And I said the basic elements. I know it's not the same thing, but in terms of her question about what we're trying to achieve, those were the things we discussed during that time. It's in a different system here, but the question was, what are we trying to achieve? And that's what I'm addressing, was discussed with institutions in that other format. And some of those elements are here, and one can disagree with those. And I think it's important to say we have responded to things that institutions have brought up over the months. We have made changes over the last 8 months. We've had this on the table. We've met with provosts, business officers, various people over time, and we have made adjustments. And there well may be adjustments we need to make today. We acknowledge that, and I think it's important that you know that. So these are important discussions, but it's also important to remember that this didn't just come out of the blue. We have been talking about it, and you've raised some questions today that I think are important questions that haven't been brought up before.
So
the ones you've been talking about, Stanton.
As far as implementing it as part of a carve-out of base funding, it redistributes a portion of the funding that would already have been directed to certain institutions. Mm-hmm. And I guess I can't connect what the outcomes are that you've just eloquently described for us and where the money goes and where it comes from.
Yeah, because David, during all those discussions, all the runs relating to success points, internal discussions, particularly at my institution, were that we were always in favor of that because we were always the #1 institution in the generation of success points. Mm-hmm. But we chose not to say anything, needless to say, because of the redistribution that may occur, but we thought we'd be the biggest winner. In every run that we have seen, we lose money. both in the current allocation or even the application of these points. In fact, just some of the runs that I've seen, the top 6 institutions in success points, 4 of them end up losing money in whatever categorization you have. And so we're just trying to see what the correlation is between the points you generate and the dollars you get.
I understand that question. I want everyone to understand I'm not responding to how the dollars flow, but the specific question is what are we trying to achieve from a student outcome standpoint.
But if you want us to behave based on dollars and you lose money, it's not an incentive.
Well, once again, I want to go back to what I said earlier. First of all, we are talking about changing, incentivizing changes in behavior to get better results. We don't know. The runs that you've done and that we've done are retrospective. They don't indicate what will happen once we implement these metrics and institutions respond with innovation and with the development of new programs and so forth. So taking the retrospective look has a very limited usefulness. I can tell you that we have at least a couple of institutions that when we first started talking about performance-based funding several years ago, that they started making changes in the way they oversee the notion of student success. And those institutions within a period of 3 or 4 years would already receive more money than they would under the old formula if the new metrics were implemented.
Plus there are changes in the nature, and I think there's a difference between what would happen now versus what could happen in coming years. For example, I was looking at the percentage of students at UT Austin with Pell Grants, and if you compare that number to 2000, there are about 5-6 percentage points more students with Pell Grants. I think there's students in the pipeline at UT Austin that may show up on the success end through the risk measures that might not have. Of course, because it's the formula, we don't know how that will be distributed exactly, and we understand that because of what everyone else is doing, and that's an unpredictable aspect now with the current formula. There's always that aspect everyone faces because some institutions are growing, some aren't. We have about 400,000 more students now than we had in 2000. Those are at some institutions and not at others. Schools that are capped, that doesn't, the current formula doesn't work well in terms of funding. I think from the perspective of an institution that's capped, we see this as a way that capped institutions can actually get increased funds over time without just relying on enrollment. But of course that isn't guaranteed because you don't know what everyone else will do any more than the current formula does. So,
and I think that both of you have made really good points, but I think that part of your responses also are driving some of the apprehension at the institutions. You talked about retrospective doesn't give us an idea of what we're going to have to do in the future. You talked about changing behaviors to increase these outcomes, which I think all of us would like to increase our graduation rates. We'd all like to have more students completing courses and not dropping courses. I think that's a given for everyone. But to fund some of the necessary infrastructure to dramatically alter the outcomes at some institutions is a hell of a gamble you're asking them to take. I'm a president. I'm looking at a 20% reduction in my funding from the state of Texas, and you're asking me to invest $5–10 million into academic support programs, mentoring programs, smaller classes, because sometime in the future I may get some of that money back, but 2 years from now we don't know what the pool's going to be, we don't know what the growth of other institutions are going to be. It's a moving target. So without a guarantee of a return on my investment in very tough economic times, it's hard for us to embrace this concept of invest in infrastructure now, you will be rewarded in the future.
I think that's very
So
fair.
I just want you all to try, that's part of the apprehension that I think you're seeing. It's not specifically anybody is opposed to trying to raise their graduation rates. Nobody's questioning the validity or the value of the outcomes that you are trying to provide an incentive for. I think at this particular time, there is so much anxiety about the general level of funding, about what's going to happen 2 years from now, that now we're adding another piece onto that where you're asking us in good faith, make an investment to change behavior, you will be rewarded, but you can't provide a guarantee for that reward, nor can this current legislature bind a future legislature to provide that guarantee. So there's so many variables out there. There's just a lot of anxiety.
So where if economic times were good, this would be a good model?
I'm not going to answer that question for anyone else in the room.
Okay, one of the things you have to
yourself?
understand, we understand that this is a change. However, as you all know, or most of you all understand, is that the formulas are an allocation. So when you, even on attempted hours, if you're not growing, you're gonna, I mean, things
Believe
are gonna
me, we
shift.
know that.
You know that. I mean,
Well,
you know that better than
and you know, the A&M system, we model it every semester, and our institutions know each semester where they stand relative to everyone else in the state, and have a pretty good idea before the LBB even runs their formulas where we're going to be. But when we're looking at like what the House Appropriations Committee is doing and parking that money at the coordinating board, we don't have predictability to plan for 2 years ahead. And that does make us a little nervous. You know, we don't know what that's going to be in 2 years because the side on the increase isn't as stable. The sides on your total degree is pretty stable, and there's some changes, but not a lot.
And that is
this
something
other
that-
side is pretty unpredictable.
And that is something that we can talk about. Stanton or somebody raised it in a thing where each incentive point on the increase side is worth 12 times as much as a single point on the average side. And so we have actually done some runs looking at different variabilities in that in Linda's. Oh, it's in there. And it's in there in the spreadsheet where. Okay. Well, and so we have done some runs. Okay. We have done some runs where we changed, what we've done is we've done like 30%, 70%, 20%, 80%. We do believe that we want to incentivize people to continue to try and increase.
I guess the point I was
And
trying
maybe
to
the
make
12 to 1 is not the right amount.
was
but-
the commissioner was talking about this is retroactive and it's not going to really reflect what you're going to get. Part of what we've said all along in being for the performance incentive fund or for anything is we need some predictability and stability. And when it was outside the formula and supplemental to the formula, we still had our base that was predictable, and that we look at as soft money that can come and go. When it's not predictable and it's your base funding, and we're not going to know until 3 months before or 4 months before the beginning of a fiscal year when you all allocate it out and give the money to the numbers to the LBB and the comptroller, that's unworkable for planning for an institution.
In that case, would it be better if we used the current numbers and they funded it right now, and then you would have it, that amount, then you would know that that would take care of it. You would know exactly how much you were going to get.
That would be predictable in that
It would be
case.
predictable in that sense.
I can't speak on behalf of anyone. I mean, we'd really have to visit.
Once again, I want to underscore the point that I made before. This does not increase the variability of formula funding. Enrollment is a very significant variable. There are swings in formula funding of several $1 million from biennium to biennium based on enrollment. And this does not increase that variability at all. So that it doesn't increase it doesn't decrease the amount of information you have available to you when you plan.
It does, because we know what our enrollment's going to be.
You don't know what the enrollment of the other institutions is, and their enrollments will affect your share of formula funding based on enrollment.
Semester, we get the enrollment data for all the institutions from you all, and we model it, and we have a pretty sophisticated model at the A&M system that does help us predict, and we know what our market share is, we can come pretty close to knowing how we're going to end up before
We
the
can
LPB.
provide you with this other information.
We can
as well.
provide you the
If
information.
that's your
Fine,
concern, we
but
can
what I'm
definitely
saying
do
is
that
when
for
it's,
you.
you were saying this was not going to be retroactive, we weren't going to, these numbers weren't what we were going to be getting, that's where it becomes the problem.
And I think what the commission was intending to point out is that as things go forward, you don't know what your performance will be on some of these measures in the future or other institutions' performance. And, Mike's points were very, on the mark in terms of that. That's known. And I think what you said is important. We would be glad to provide you with all of that information for institutions across the state. I think that's important to do. And we don't misunderstand. We really understand the position everyone's in, because we're in the same position as an agency in terms of the uncertainty of the budget and dollars moving forward. Every one of us is sitting in that same kind of chair. I mean, our budget was, at this point, reduced 57%.
And if y'all decide, or if we decide that the stability of knowing how much you're going to get in 13 is more important than using the latest data, then we would, I think, support saying, okay, this is what you're going to get. We'll continue to use this model, and we'll model it every year to see what those changes would be and move it out. I think we would probably be okay with that. So if the stability factor is much more important, so that at the end of the session, assuming that the governor signs everything, that this is how much money you're going to have in 13, and not be saying, okay, we want to use the 2011 data, because we will be using 2011. We're not going to wait until September to allocate that amount. We would use the 2011 FY11 degrees awarded, that sort of thing, to do the FY13. So you would know well in advance what you're going to get for 13. And 12 would already be set in the appropriations.
And we'd be glad to do that.
Because we're not trying to add a level where, okay, 3 months in advance, when actually a month, because you have to approve your budget in July for 13. We understand that you don't want to know right then. So we would be using 11 so that y'all would have an idea of how much money you would be getting for FY13.
We are very much aware of the need for every campus and the systems to have as much information about what your funding levels are likely to be, either under a strictly enrollment scenario or under the 90-10% split that we're proposing. We recognize that we have to get you information so that you can plan as quickly as possible, and we're committed to doing that and to working with you to make sure that actually occurs.
And doing it in a uniform way so we provide everybody with the same type of information at the same time.
We've been, for example, we've been saying to the legislature, with the uncertainties of the budget, with the uncertainties about Texas grants, which will have a very significant impact, according to testimony yesterday, on the enrollment of certain institutions. We've been urging the legislature, please, we need decisions as quickly as possible. We recognize the difficulties, and we know that there will be a transition period which will not be entirely smooth. But we believe very strongly at the coordinating board we have to incentivize institutions to produce more graduates.
So for the institutions that are doing well right now, relatively well in success points, to increase either their share of success points or the dollar amounts allocated, and it's always contingent upon each institution, what's going to have to occur is going to be somewhat remote in terms of capacity. Maybe at some of the at-risk levels, maybe in the predicted levels of the regression analysis, we may be able to. But I do think that even though the retrospective assessment may not be the way to look in the future, what's going to happen, it's difficult to have a level of confidence in this model when the institutions that are performing well relative to the other institutions are going to do well in the future?
Well, let me respond in one way to that question. First of all, we believe very strongly that these metrics will work. We've done a lot of runs. We've had a lot of discussions. We've thought, we've considered virtually every question that's been raised about these metrics. When I hear a question, I immediately go running to David or Susan and say, what's the answer to this question? And then I say, and if we don't have one, we need to get one right away. And I've said to the legislature, and I'll say to this group, that I appreciate this frank discussion, because if we can't answer tough questions, we shouldn't put forward this proposal. I can tell you this: we are going to evaluate the way this formula funding recommendation works, and if it doesn't work, we'll either modify it or we'll recommend some other approach. We are committed to making this work with a minimum amount of disruption. I can tell you this: that I've been on a university campus when we've went through 2 or 3 different models of formula funding from the state, and in every case there was the same amount of apprehension that there is now, and after 2 or 3 years the response from the institutions was, this is the way we like it this way, we're used to it, don't change anything. We're going through that now.
I think the question may not be so much about what you're trying to do, it's the manner in which it's being done. And I think it's the aspect of the formula, particularly for institutions that are probably doing well, and being an additive aspect to the formula rather than being a component of the formula. And it gets to the heart of what Stan was talking about, because the carve-out is the carve-out of something. And for those institutions that generally do well, it's generally within the graduate-producing institutions. And that's what's at stake here. And so when you talk about accommodation regarding change, well, yeah, I mean, we will accommodate regardless of what, but there's something that's at risk or being given up, and that's, I think, the point. That
what's being given up is the practice of funding entirely based on enrollment. That's what's being given up.
Well, and graduate enrollment too.
I think I've told some of you this privately, so I'll say it publicly. I'm uncomfortable being in possibly being perceived, I would say personally misperceived, as having objections to basing some of our funding on performance. I'm not opposed to that. I think it's a good idea. When this was done outside the regular base funding formulas, we had stability in what it takes to continue operations. All those students we're currently producing each year are a new batch. So they cost money too. You don't give up what it takes to continue doing what you're doing in order to do better on something new. You have to continue at the current level of effort to maintain the current level of production. When we carve out a portion of the base funding formulas for this good purpose, we create problems that I don't think have been truly appreciated. Not because of anyone's malintentions, none whatsoever. If you have remarked, and I know it's true, that as you've gone about the state and you've talked about the current, I don't even know for sure what the name is, the incentive funding model that we've had for 2 biennia, yes, we've all been pleased with that. We testified to that in September in the LAR hearings. Every one of us, I suspect to a given institution, everyone did. Because the premise there is those are funds outside our base funding formula. They're not a carve-out. When we do the carve-out, we inevitably change proportionality within each institution's funding, having to do with some of the intricacies of the formula. And those, I know, are not intentional, but they are real nonetheless. And so raising concerns about those things are not objecting to funding on performance.
Stanton, I recognize that. I'm not at all suggesting that there's opposition to the notion that we need to produce more graduates with rigorous degrees. I don't doubt for a moment that institutions are very much concerned about that issue. I would simply argue that funding more directly on those particular results is likely to create more innovation, more attention to this issue among the myriad of issues that universities deal with.
I think we're talking past each other, because I would agree with that too. If the funding we're talking about allocating under this model is not a takeaway from our existing formula, almost all the concerns we have lie in that fact, in that methodology.
We have a question online from Christopher Forrest, Vice President for Business Affairs at UT Permian Basin. Have you considered any model that deals with transfer students and their graduation rates from the four-year institutions? I think I heard the current model focuses only on first-time, full-time freshmen and maybe only recent high school graduates, traditional students.
Good question, and we need to clarify that, Susan.
I'm going to clarify that. The degrees awarded are for all of your students who graduate, not just those that are first-time, full-time. The only part that looks at first-time, full-time is the predicted graduation rate versus the actual graduation rate. That is only that one column that deals with that. The rest of it is on all of your graduates, not just those that come from your institution or native to your institution. It includes all your transfers if they're from another university or another community college, or any place else you could get them. Out-of-state students that come in and graduate, those are all included in those measures.
And the predicted graduation rate, again, accounts for?
Yeah, the predicted graduation rate, that one thing, only accounts for 1.3% of this pot of money, and that's it.
1.3% of the 10%.
Yeah, 1.3% of the 10% of the undergraduate funding. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up in response to Stanton's is that the funding that you get for this model is very similar to the funding that you get for your attempted hours. You get one pot of money. Nobody's saying how you were supposed to spend this money. This is not, I mean, when you get your money currently in the attempted hour funding, it comes to you, your institution determines how it is spent. And that is not going to change under this. You make the decision, your institution makes its own decision of how the money's spent. What we have been looking at is the variability, total dollars, all funds, variability between 100% attempted hours and this model. So yes, there are winners and losers. There's winners and losers when you look at 100% attempted hours too. So we're not trying to change that part. We're not saying you have to spend this money this way. We're saying this is how you earn the money.
We're getting close to noon. I just found out that the House is adjourned, and I know some of you have to get back there. We'll take any final questions. I would also urge you, if some of you have questions that you haven't had the opportunity to ask during this meeting, please feel free to email Susan, David, or me, and we'll get you an answer.
Or if you have recommendations for this
recommendations,
model,
yes.
how it would be more palatable or meaningful, we really want to hear those. We are flexible, and we have made adjustments, and you can assume that we're still willing to.
Any final questions before we adjourn?
Thank y'all again for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming on such short notice.
Thank you.